Every cell in your body runs on a molecular switch. When you eat, it flips one way: growth, storage, accumulation. When you stop eating long enough, it flips the other: repair, recycling, renewal. Most people in the modern world have never held that switch in the second position long enough for the repair systems to fully engage. Eating once a day is not a diet. It is the deliberate act of flipping that switch and holding it long enough to find out what your body is actually capable of doing when digestion finally gets out of the way. You have probably felt it without being able to name it. You skip breakfast, the morning stretches longer than expected, and somewhere around midday you notice that your head is unusually clear, not wired on caffeine, actually clear, alert without anxiety, focused without effort. And then you eat, and within an hour, the thickness returns. You dismissed it as coincidence, or timing, or the particular alignment of a good night's sleep. But what you were experiencing was your metabolism crossing a threshold, a specific, measurable, biochemically documented transition point at which your body stops processing last night's meal and starts doing something considerably more interesting with the time. This episode is the hour-by-hour map of what that transition actually involves. The insulin mechanics that govern the first 4 hours, the metabolic switch that engages at the 12-hour mark, the autophagy cascade that begins around 16 hours, in which your cells start dismantling their own damaged architecture and recycling it into clean raw material, and the growth hormone surge documented in a clinical trial at Intermountain Medical Center that revealed a 1,300% increase in women and nearly 2,000% in men over 24 hours of fasting, a number so large that when it was first published, it changed the conversation about what fasting actually does to the body. Hours 0 to 8. Here is the single most important piece of metabolic biology to understand before the rest of this timeline makes sense, because everything that happens across a 23-hour fast is, at its root, a consequence of one hormone's relationship with one enzyme. Insulin is secreted by the pancreas in direct response to rising blood glucose. It rises when you eat and falls when you have not eaten for long enough. Its primary job is to signal cells to take up glucose from the bloodstream and either burn it for immediate energy or package it as glycogen in the liver and muscles. The secondary effect, and the one that governs the entire fasting story, is that elevated insulin directly suppresses lipolysis, the process by which hormone-sensitive lipase breaks down stored fat in adipose tissue. When insulin is high, fat cells are effectively sealed. The mechanism is precise. Insulin activates phosphodiesterase, which degrades cyclic AMP, which is required for hormone-sensitive lipase activation. No cyclic AMP, no lipase activation, no fat breakdown. The lock is chemical, not willpower. And here is the timeline. For the first 4 hours, insulin remains elevated and actively suppressing fat oxidation. The body processes the meal, breaking proteins into amino acids, converting carbohydrates into glucose, directing energy into cells and glycogen stores. Between 4 and 8 hours, insulin begins declining as the meal's glucose load clears the bloodstream. The liver draws on its glycogen reserve. This is the window where hunger signals intensify. Ghrelin rises as the meal-derived glucose falls. The discomfort here is not starvation, it is your body switching fuels from the immediate dietary energy that has run out to the stored energy that requires insulin to be low enough to access. The difficulty of the transition is proportional to how carbohydrate-dependent your metabolism has become. Think of your fat stores as a vault. They are not inaccessible because of a shortage of energy or a failure of biology. They are inaccessible because the lock requires insulin to fall below a specific threshold before it will open. The body cannot override this. It is a biochemical gate. Every hour you extend the fast brings insulin closer to that threshold. The discomfort you feel in hours 4 through 8 is not a warning signal from a body in distress, it is the sound of a lock mechanism turning. Hours 8 to 16. Here is the specific biochemical transition point that the research terms the metabolic switch, the moment at which the body's primary fuel source shifts from circulating glucose and hepatic glycogen to fatty acids and the ketone bodies derived from them. As hepatic glycogen stores deplete across hours 8 to 16, glucagon rises to compensate, directing the liver to release remaining stored glucose and initiate gluconeogenesis. Simultaneously, insulin falls to its lowest baseline level. This hormonal combination activates hormone-sensitive lipase, releasing fatty acids from adipose tissue into the bloodstream. The liver begins beta oxidation, breaking fatty acids down for energy and producing ketone bodies, primarily beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetyl acetate. A 2025 review in the journal Nutrients confirms that circulating ketone concentrations begin a detectable rise between 12 and 24 hours into a fast, with the transition occurring within 12 to 36 hours depending on hepatic glycogen stores, insulin sensitivity, and activity level. And here is what ketone bodies actually do in the brain. The brain cannot oxidize fatty acids directly. In the fed state, it runs primarily on glucose. In the fasted state, as glucose becomes less available, the brain transitions to beta-hydroxybutyrate, which crosses the blood-brain barrier efficiently. Research on ketone metabolism suggests beta-hydroxybutyrate produces ATP per molecule of oxygen consumed at a slightly more efficient rate than glucose, with reduced production of reactive oxygen species as a byproduct. The cognitive clarity that some people report at this stage of the fast corresponds to the brain's transition to a more metabolically efficient fuel source, combined with the stabilization of blood glucose that fat oxidation produces. Hours 16 to 20. Now here is the part of the fasting timeline that attracted the most serious scientific attention in the last decade. The cellular recycling process that was awarded the 2016 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, that every pharmaceutical longevity researcher in the world is trying to replicate with a drug, and that a sufficiently long daily fast activates through a mechanism so elegant and precise that it represents one of the most compelling arguments for periodic fasting available from any direction of evidence. Autophagy is a process of intracellular degradation and recycling in which damaged proteins, dysfunctional organelles, and accumulated cellular debris are enclosed in a double membrane vesicle called an autophagosome, which then fuses with a lysosome, the cell's acid-filled recycling chamber, where the contents are broken down and the resulting amino acids and lipids are returned to the cell as raw building material. The process is regulated primarily through two opposing molecular sensors: mTOR, which promotes cell growth and suppresses autophagy when nutrients are abundant, and AMPK, which activates autophagy when cellular energy is low. During extended fasting, as glucose and amino acid availability fall, the ATP to AMP ratio drops, activating AMPK, which inhibits mTOR and phosphorylates ULK1, the initiating kinase of the autophagy cascade. A 2025 review in Nutrients cites the current evidence establishing that autophagy is typically initiated after approximately 16 hours of fasting, with activity progressively increasing as the fast extends. The cellular material targeted by autophagy is not arbitrary. It preferentially processes what the cell identifies as damaged or surplus: oxidatively modified proteins that have lost their functional shape, mitochondria that are no longer generating ATP efficiently, cellular components that accumulated during the fed state growth phase but are no longer serving their purpose. The lysosomal degradation of this material returns its constituent amino acids and lipids to the cell pool, raw material for the synthesis of new functional structures. Hours 20 to 23. Here is the finding that most directly addresses the concern almost everyone brings to the fasting conversation: the fear of muscle loss. And it comes not from a theoretical argument about what fasting should do, but from a clinical trial with measured blood values showing what fasting actually does to the hormone most responsible for protecting lean tissue. Growth hormone is secreted by the pituitary gland and functions as a primary signal for protein synthesis, fat mobilization, and lean tissue maintenance. In the normal fed state, insulin suppresses growth hormone release. As insulin falls during extended fasting and the pituitary is no longer inhibited, growth hormone secretion amplifies dramatically. Two clinical trials conducted at Intermountain Medical Center in Utah, involving over 200 participants across both studies, measured the response of human growth hormone to 24-hour water-only fasting. The results showed that during 24-hour fasting periods, HGH increased an average of 1,300% in women and nearly 2,000% in men. A separate crossover study confirmed that in another cohort, HGH increased approximately 5-fold in males and 14-fold in females during a 24-hour water-only fast. These increases were confirmed to be independent of weight loss, meaning the growth hormone elevation is a direct endocrine response to the fasting state itself. The fasting-induced HGH elevation also correlated inversely with cardiometabolic risk factors. Participants with higher baseline cardiovascular and metabolic risk showed the largest relative increases. The implication for the muscle loss concern is straightforward. A body in which growth hormone is elevated by 1,300 to 2,000% is not a body consuming its own lean tissue for energy. It is a body that is biochemically instructed to protect lean tissue while drawing on fat reserves, one of the most favorable body composition environments the endocrine system can produce. And here is the complete honest context the OMAD timeline requires. The metabolic timeline in this episode describes processes that are well documented in the physiology literature for healthy adults. These are not speculative mechanisms. They are documented in multiple peer-reviewed studies with measured blood markers and molecular data. The honest caveat is that OMAD is an extreme application of time-restricted eating, and the research on it specifically, as opposed to 16 to 18 intermittent fasting protocols, is considerably thinner. Most mechanisms described here are documented at the 16 to 24-hour range. Whether daily 23-hour restriction produces optimal outcomes compared to less extreme protocols for most populations is genuinely unsettled. OMAD is not appropriate for people with a history of eating disorders, pregnant and breastfeeding women, people with type 1 diabetes or those taking insulin or other glucose-regulating medications, for whom extended fasting creates serious hypoglycemia risk without careful medical supervision. Anyone with thyroid dysfunction, adrenal issues, or already elevated cortisol. The adaptation period is real. The first week typically involves electrolyte loss as insulin drops and the kidneys excrete sodium and water. Replacing sodium, potassium, and magnesium during the fasting window addresses the headaches, fatigue, and cramping that often drive people to abandon the protocol prematurely. These symptoms are physiological transition, not evidence of harm, and they require electrolyte support, not food. Here is the complete biochemical map. Hours 0 to 8. Insulin elevates and falls. Glycogen stores deplete, the fuel switching discomfort of the carbohydrate to fat transition. Hours 8 to 16. The metabolic switch crosses. Hormone-sensitive lipase activates. Free fatty acids flood the liver. Beta oxidation begins. Ketones enter the bloodstream and reach the brain. Cognitive clarity emerges from metabolic stability. Hours 16 to 20. mTOR is progressively inhibited by rising AMPK. The autophagy cascade initiates. Autophagosomes form around damaged proteins and dysfunctional organelles. Lysosomal degradation recycles cellular debris into clean amino acids and lipids. Hours 20 to 23. Growth hormone surges to levels documented in clinical trials at 1,300% in women and nearly 2,000% in men, protecting lean tissue while the fat-burning machinery operates at full capacity. Insulin sensitivity reaches its daily maximum. The body is biochemically primed for the eating window. And here is the part of the OMAD protocol that the biology makes non-negotiable. The insulin sensitivity at hour 23 is at its maximum. A high-carbohydrate meal produces a larger insulin response than it would mid-morning after a normal breakfast. A meal that floods a fasted system with rapidly digested carbohydrates produces a glucose spike, a corresponding insulin surge, and within an hour, the metabolic benefits of the preceding 23 hours are biochemically reversed. The nutritional logic of OMAD is not just that you eat less frequently, it is that the meal composition must match the metabolic state the fast created. High-quality protein to supply amino acids for the structural synthesis elevated growth hormone is primed to drive. Healthy fats to extend fat oxidation mode through the eating window. And a substantial volume of micronutrient-dense vegetables and fermented foods to meet requirements a single daily meal must now entirely deliver. Drop a comment right now. Have you tried any form of extended fasting, and which part of this timeline matched what you actually experienced in your own body? I read every single one. If this gave you a more precise understanding of the biochemistry behind why the fasting protocol feels the way it does, hit subscribe. Every video in this series goes this deep into the physiology, rather than stopping at the surface claim. And next, the specific fasting window timing that matters most. Early time-restricted eating versus evening time-restricted eating, and what the circadian biology research says about why when you eat your one meal has measurable effects on insulin sensitivity, cortisol, and body composition that the basic OMAD protocol ignores. Subscribe so you are there when it drops. The switch is real. The biology is documented. Now you know exactly what you are flipping.